April 15th, 1817. The hour had just passed 8 in the evening when Miss Eleanor Thornhill took her customary position along the gilded periphery of Lady Harrington's grand ballroom, a space she had occupied at countless such gatherings, a location as familiar to her now as her own shadow. The chandeliers above cast their relentless golden light across the assembled company, illuminating silks and jewels and eager faces turned always toward the center, toward the dancers, toward those who mattered. Eleanor had long since accepted that she would never be counted among their number. At 28, she had passed beyond the bloom of youth into that peculiar territory society reserved for women who had missed their chance, who had become invisible even while standing in plain sight. Her gown of lavender silk, selected by her mother with anxious hands and anxious hopes, seemed only to emphasize what everyone already knew, that she was fading into the wallpaper of spinsterhood, becoming part of the architecture rather than the event itself. She watched as her cousin Sophia, radiant in pale pink with rosebuds woven through her golden curls, laughed at something a young gentleman whispered, and Eleanor felt the old familiar ache. Not of jealousy precisely, but of resignation, the settled sorrow of one who has made peace with exclusion. Then he arrived. The Duke of Pembroke entered the ballroom with the kind of presence that shifted the very air, tall and commanding with dark hair and darker eyes, recently returned from abroad, and Eleanor watched as the room seemed to inhale collectively, as every matchmaking mamma straightened and every eligible daughter brightened. She had observed him from afar before, at the theatre, in the park, always at a distance, always as one observes a figure in a painting, beautiful and utterly removed from the realm of possibility. Lady Harrington herself rushed forward to greet him, and within moments the dance cards were filling, the whispers accelerating. Eleanor noted with detached interest how he moved through his social obligations, bowing, requesting dances, his expression polite but somehow distant, as though he performed a role he had rehearsed too many times. He danced with Lady Caroline Ashford first, her emerald gown swirling. Then Miss Beatrice Sinclair, who blushed deeply throughout. Then Sophia, who glowed with triumph. And then Sophia again, for a second dance that had the gossips murmuring about intentions and announcements. He danced with Miss Lucy Chamberlain and Miss Charlotte Redmond and Lady Frances Westbrook. He danced, it seemed, with every eligible woman in the room, working his way through society's carefully curated collection of suitable brides with mechanical precision. Eleanor counted them without meaning to, each dance another confirmation of what she had always known, that she existed outside the boundaries of consideration, that she was furniture, not prospect. She told herself it did not matter, that she had not expected anything different, but the tightness in her chest suggested otherwise. As the evening wore on and the music swelled and the laughter grew louder, Eleanor remained in her position by the gilt mirrors, watching. Always watching, and in one brief moment, when the Duke turned between partners, his gaze swept across the room and seemed, for just a heartbeat, to land on her, to truly see her standing there in her lavender gown. But then the moment passed, and he was claimed by another eager partner, and Eleanor wondered if she had imagined that flicker of recognition entirely. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. By 11 in the evening, the truth of Eleanor's position had become undeniable even to her most resilient defenses, for the Duke had now partnered with every eligible woman present, every debutante and every remotely suitable lady, and Eleanor alone remained unasked, her dance card as empty as it had been at the beginning of the evening, a blank testament to her invisibility. She had not expected anything different, she reminded herself, had not harboured any foolish hopes. Yet somehow the completeness of the exclusion stung more sharply than usual. Perhaps because his presence had been so commanding. Perhaps because for that one brief moment she had imagined his eyes had found hers across the crowded room. The whispers reached her in fragments, as they always did, the cruel observations spoken just loudly enough for her to hear, whether by accident or design, she could never quite determine. Lady Pemberton's voice carried from behind a nearby column, remarking to her companion that it was almost charitable of Lady Harrington to continue inviting poor Miss Thornhill to these events, though what the poor dear hoped to accomplish at her age was anyone's guess. Miss Lydia Fairfax, standing with a cluster of young women near the refreshment table, laughed and said something about wallflowers and furniture, and though Eleanor could not hear the complete remark, the glances cast in her direction told her enough. Her aunt, Mrs. Harriet Langley, appeared at her elbow with a glass of lemonade and a look of barely concealed fury, her weathered face tight with protective anger at what she had witnessed. But Eleanor touched her arm gently and shook her head, silently communicating that there was no point in protest, that this was simply the way of things. Across the ballroom, the Duke was taking his leave of Lady Harrington, bowing over her hand with practised grace, and Eleanor observed how the room seemed to deflate slightly at his departure, how the gossips immediately clustered to discuss whom he had favoured, which lady had received the most attention, whether an announcement might be forthcoming. She heard Sophia's name mentioned repeatedly, for had he not danced with her twice, and did that not indicate particular interest, and had anyone noticed how long they had conversed between sets? Eleanor's name, predictably, was absent from all speculation, as though she had not been present at all, as though she were truly as invisible as she felt. The Duke paused at the ballroom entrance, turning back for a final survey of the assembled company, and in that moment his gaze swept the room once more and landed unmistakably this time directly upon Eleanor, where she stood beside her aunt in her lavender gown, and something flickered in his expression, something she could not name, before he turned and disappeared into the night. The weather had turned cool, Eleanor noticed as she and her aunt made their way to their carriage, a hint of rain in the air, and as they rolled through the dark London streets toward home, she sat in silence, her hands folded in her lap, feeling the familiar weight of resignation settle over her once more, telling herself that tomorrow she would wake, and this evening would fade into the catalogue of other evenings just like it, that nothing had changed, that nothing ever would, even as some small rebellious part of her heart insisted on remembering the way he had looked at her in that final moment before he left, as though he had seen something worth remembering in the woman everyone else had forgotten. April 18th, 1817. 3 days had passed since the ball, and Eleanor Thornhill had spent most of those hours in the small garden behind her family's modest London residence, a book open in her lap, though she found herself reading the same page repeatedly without comprehension. The Thornhill home was respectable enough, neither grand nor shabby, occupying that middle territory of genteel society where appearances required constant maintenance and every expense demanded careful consideration. Spring had arrived in earnest, filling the garden with the scent of early roses and lilac, and Eleanor found herself drawn to this quiet space, as she always did when the weight of disappointment grew too heavy to bear indoors. Her mother, Lady Catherine Thornhill, had been hovering since breakfast, her anxiety palpable in every glance and sigh, and Eleanor knew without being told that the gossip from the ball had reached their household, that everyone now knew the Duke had danced with every eligible woman except her, that even this small hope, which Eleanor had not consciously allowed herself to entertain, had been publicly extinguished. Through the morning-room windows, Eleanor could see the steady arrival of letters and flowers for Sophia, who was visiting today, and holding court in the drawing-room with their mother, her laughter carrying into the garden like wind chimes, bright and careless. Eleanor had counted 7 bouquets delivered before noon, and she knew without asking that at least some carried notes from the Duke, for had he not danced with Sophia twice, and did that not indicate particular favour? Her mother had come to the garden once already, wringing her hands and asking in that carefully controlled voice whether Eleanor might not try a bit harder at the next social engagement, might not smile more, or position herself more favourably, as though Eleanor had not spent 10 years attempting precisely that before surrendering to the mathematics of her situation. Mrs. Harriet Langley, her widowed aunt, who lived with them and served as the only buffer between Eleanor and complete despair, had found her an hour ago and sat beside her without speaking, simply sharing the space and the spring sunshine, understanding in her silence what words could not adequately express. Eleanor had opened her book again, a volume of philosophy she had borrowed from the subscription library, finding comfort in ideas and arguments that engaged her mind in ways society never did, and she was deep in a passage about the nature of perception when her mother's voice called from the house, tight with forced brightness, summoning her inside because Sophia wished to speak with her. Eleanor marked her place, smoothed her simple morning gown of pale grey muslin, and walked slowly toward the house, steeling herself for whatever lay ahead, knowing that Sophia's visits, however well-intentioned, always left her feeling more acutely aware of everything she lacked, everything she would never be. Inside, the morning room was filled with flowers, their heavy perfume almost suffocating, and Sophia sat, surrounded by opened notes and invitations, her pink walking dress and fashionable bonnet making her look like an illustration from a ladies' magazine, while their mother poured tea with hands that trembled slightly, and Eleanor took her seat and folded her hands and prepared herself to be gracious in the face of her cousin's unintentional cruelty, to smile and congratulate and pretend that her heart had not calcified just a bit more with each bouquet that arrived bearing someone else's name. April 25th, 1817. 1 week had passed since the ball, and Alexander Pembroke, Duke of Pembroke, stood in his study overlooking the morning streets of London, restless in a way he could not adequately explain to himself or to Lord George Ashford, his oldest friend, who sat in the leather chair by the window, observing him with undisguised curiosity and no small amount of amusement. The study was a masculine refuge filled with mementos from Alexander's travels, artifacts from Greece and Italy arranged on shelves beside volumes of history and philosophy, and morning light streamed through tall windows illuminating the disorder of correspondence scattered across his desk, invitations and introductions, and thinly veiled offers of marriage that had arrived in overwhelming numbers since his return to England 3 months prior. George had come ostensibly to discuss plans for an upcoming hunting party, but had quickly turned the conversation toward the subject everyone in society was discussing, namely why the Duke had danced with every eligible woman at Lady Harrington's ball without showing particular favour to any, and more pressingly, why he had not yet announced his intentions when everyone knew he had returned to England specifically to secure an heir, and when his family's expectations weighed upon him with increasing urgency. Alexander turned from the window and picked up a list his mother had helpfully provided, a catalogue of suitable ladies arranged by rank and fortune, each name representing a perfectly acceptable choice. Women who were beautiful or accomplished or well-connected or some combination thereof, and yet as he read through the names, he felt nothing but a vague sense of suffocation, as though he were being asked to select wallpaper rather than a partner for life. George remarked that Miss Sophia Beaumont seemed particularly taken with him, for had he not danced with her twice, and was she not lovely and charming and exactly the sort of bride society would expect a duke to choose? And Alexander made a non-committal sound and set the list aside, unable to articulate even to his closest friend that something essential was missing from every interaction he had endured that evening, that the conversations had been pleasant but empty, the the smiles practiced but hollow, the entire exercise feeling like a performance in which everyone played their assigned roles without any genuine connection. He had done his duty, had danced and conversed, and maintained the polite fictions society demanded, and yet at the end of the evening he had left with a strange sense of dissatisfaction and a memory that kept returning unbidden. The image of a woman in a lavender gown who had stood at the edges of the ballroom with a book in her hands and intelligence in her eyes, watching the proceedings with an expression that suggested both resignation and something else, something that looked remarkably like understanding, or perhaps quiet dignity in the face of dismissal. George leaned forward and asked directly whether Alexander had made any decision, whether any of the ladies had captured his interest, and Alexander hesitated, aware that what he was about to say would sound absurd, before admitting that he could not stop thinking about a woman he had not danced with, had not even spoken to, whose name he did not yet know, but whose face had remained with him in the days since, haunting him with its quiet composure and the hint of depth he had glimpsed in that single moment when their eyes met across the crowded room before he departed. May 2nd, 1817. 1 week had passed since Alexander's conversation with George, and the afternoon sun warmed the gardens of Somerset Estate, where Lady Somerset had arranged an intimate gathering of 40 guests among the roses and carefully manicured walking paths, the kind of event Eleanor Thornhill normally avoided, but which Mrs. Langley had insisted she attend, citing the pleasant weather and the need for Eleanor to emerge from her self-imposed isolation following the humiliation of Lady Harrington's ball. Eleanor had agreed reluctantly, wearing a sage-green dress that Mrs. Langley had helped her select, a colour that brought out the deeper tones in her eyes, though Eleanor suspected it would make little difference, for she had long ago perfected the art of social invisibility, and expected nothing different from this afternoon than from any other such gathering. The gardens were lovely, she admitted to herself as they arrived, with roses in full bloom creating pockets of fragrance along the stone pathways, and refreshment tables arranged beneath white canopies where guests gathered in clusters of animated conversation, their laughter carrying across the lawns like music. Mrs. Langley guided Eleanor toward a quieter section of the garden where they might observe without being pressed into uncomfortable social exchanges, and Eleanor was grateful for her aunt's understanding, for the way she never pushed Eleanor toward interactions that would only result in polite dismissal, or worse, the particular cruelty of being included out of obligation and then ignored. They had been there perhaps 20 minutes, discussing a book they had both recently read, when Eleanor became aware of a subtle shift in the atmosphere around them, a turning of heads and adjustment of postures that indicated someone of consequence had arrived, and she glanced up to see the Duke of Pembroke entering the garden with Lord Ashford, his height and dark hair immediately recognizable even at a distance. Her heart performed an unwelcome skip that she firmly suppressed, reminding herself that his presence meant nothing to her, that she had no expectations and would not torture herself with foolish hope. And she deliberately turned her attention back to Mrs. Langley, who was watching her with knowing sympathy. Within minutes, Sophia appeared as if summoned by invisible threads, her pink dress and animated gestures drawing attention as she always did, and Eleanor watched with detached observation as her cousin positioned herself in the Duke's path, her smile bright and practiced. And yet Eleanor noticed something she had not expected, the way the Duke's responses seemed polite, but distant, the way his eyes moved across the garden as though searching for something or someone else. Mrs. Langley made a quiet observation about the warmth of the day and suggested they walk toward the rose arbor, and Eleanor agreed, grateful for movement and distraction, unaware that Alexander had noticed her the moment he entered the garden, that he had recognized her immediately despite having never been formally introduced, and that he was now maneuvering through social obligations with the specific intention of positioning himself where he might observe her more closely, and perhaps, if circumstances allowed, engineer an introduction. Eleanor and her aunt paused beside a climbing rose heavy with cream-coloured blooms, and Mrs. Langley was remarking on the gardener's skill when Eleanor heard her aunt make a soft sound of surprise, and she turned to find the Duke of Pembroke standing 10 feet away, his attention fixed directly upon her with an intensity that made her breath catch, and for the second time their eyes met and held, and this time the look lingered for 3 heartbeats, 4, long enough that Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks and confusion cloud her thoughts before he inclined his head in a small acknowledgement, and she, operating on instinct and years of ingrained propriety, dropped into a curtsy, though they had not been introduced, and he was already turning away, leaving Eleanor standing beside the roses with her heart racing, and Mrs. Langley watching her with an expression that mixed hope and concern in equal measure. May 10th, 1817. 8 days had passed since the encounter at Somerset Estate, and Eleanor sat in the Thornhill family box at the Theatre Royal on Drury Lane, positioned between her mother and Mrs. Langley, watching a production of Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing. With only partial attention, for her mind kept returning unbidden to that moment in the garden when the Duke of Pembroke had looked directly at her with an intensity that had shaken her carefully maintained composure and left her questioning meanings she knew better than to assign to a simple glance. The theatre was filled to capacity this evening, the boxes occupied by society's most prominent families, and Eleanor had dressed with more care than usual in a gown of deep burgundy that Mrs. Langley had insisted brought warmth to her complexion, though Eleanor suspected her efforts were wasted given that no one ever looked at her box except to locate Sophia, who was notably absent this evening, having chosen to attend a different entertainment with friends. The first act proceeded with Eleanor finding some genuine pleasure in the wit of the dialogue, the interplay between Beatrice and Benedick reminding her why she loved Shakespeare's comedies, when she became aware of movement in the theatre, a stirring of attention that made her mother sit up straighter and grip her fan with sudden tension, and Eleanor glanced toward the source of the disturbance to see the Duke of Pembroke entering a box 3 sections away, his arrival causing the predictable flutter of awareness that seemed to follow him wherever he went. She deliberately returned her attention to the stage, refusing to torture herself by watching him, reminding herself firmly that his presence had nothing to do with her, and that she would not spend the evening engaged in the pathetic exercise of stealing glances at a man who had merely been polite in a garden. But her determination lasted only until intermission, when the curtains closed and the audience rose to socialize, and her mother whispered urgently that someone was approaching their box, and Eleanor turned to see the Duke of Pembroke himself standing at the entrance, requesting permission to join them with a formality that seemed excessive given his rank, but which somehow made the moment feel more significant rather than less. Catherine granted permission with an eagerness that made Eleanor cringe inwardly, and then he was in their small box, bowing to each of them in turn, and when he straightened and looked directly at Eleanor, she saw something in his expression that was neither polite nor casual but rather deliberate and searching, as though he were attempting to confirm something he suspected but could not yet prove. Mrs. Langley, bless her, managed the introductions with grace and then somehow engaged Catherine in a conversation about the performance that left Eleanor and the Duke in a pocket of relative privacy despite the confined space, and he asked her opinion of the play with a directness that suggested he genuinely wanted to know her thoughts rather than merely making conversation, and Eleanor, after a moment's hesitation during which every defensive instinct urged her toward safe platitudes, decided with reckless honesty to answer truthfully, remarking that she found Beatrice's wit a refreshing contrast to the usual portrayals of women as either perfectly virtuous or irredeemably fallen, that Shakespeare seemed to understand women might possess in hilarity and humour and still be worthy of love, and she watched something shift in the Duke's expression. A lighting of interest that made her pulse quicken even as she told herself not to read meaning into what was likely mere politeness. May 12th, 1817. 2 days had passed since the theatre encounter, and Eleanor sat in the morning room of the Thornhill residence, trying to focus on her embroidery, while her mother paced near the windows with barely contained energy, having spoken of nothing but the Duke's attention since they had returned home that evening, her speculation growing more elaborate and hopeful with each retelling until Eleanor wanted to scream that it had been a simple conversation, nothing more, that expecting anything further was inviting the kind of disappointment Eleanor had learned through painful experience to avoid at all costs. The morning was bright and warm, sunlight streaming through the windows and illuminating the modest but respectable furnishings that suddenly seemed shabby when Eleanor allowed herself to imagine them through the eyes of a duke. And she told herself firmly to stop such thoughts, to remember that men of his rank did not court women like her, that whatever had prompted his politeness at the theatre had surely been satisfied and would not be repeated. And yet she could not prevent her mind from returning again and again to the way he had looked at her when she spoke of Beatrice, as though her words had genuinely interested him, as though he had been waiting to hear precisely that observation. Catherine was midway through another recounting of how the Duke had remained in their box for a full 15 minutes when the sound of carriage wheels on the street made her freeze and rush to the window, and Eleanor felt her heart perform that same unwelcome skip before she ruthlessly suppressed it, refusing to allow hope any foothold in her carefully guarded emotions. But her mother's gasp and the words, "Oh, my dear, it is—" Sophia made Eleanor look up with a mixture of relief and apprehension, for her cousin's visits lately had taken on a quality that Eleanor found increasingly difficult to bear. Sophia entered 10 minutes later in a walking dress of pale pink with a fashionable bonnet that had certainly cost more than Eleanor's entire wardrobe, her face arranged in an expression of sympathetic concern that immediately put Eleanor on edge, and after the usual greetings and the ritual of tea service, Sophia settled into the chair opposite Eleanor, and said with careful gentleness that she had heard the most extraordinary rumours and wanted to understand what had truly transpired at the theatre, for people were saying that the Duke of Pembroke had spent intermission in the Thornhill box and had conversed at length with Eleanor of all people, and though Sophia smiled as she said it, Eleanor heard the subtle emphasis on that final phrase, the suggestion that such attention directed toward Eleanor was inherently improbable and required explanation. Eleanor responded with deliberate calmness that the Duke had indeed been polite enough to pay his respects, and that they had discussed the performance briefly, nothing more, and she watched Sophia's face relax slightly, as though this confirmation of inconsequence relieved some unspoken anxiety, and Sophia proceeded to offer her theories about what might have prompted such unusual behaviour, suggesting perhaps that the Duke had been attempting to reach their box for some other purpose, and had merely been trapped by politeness into conversation, or that he had confused Eleanor with someone else in the dim lighting, each explanation more insulting than the last, though delivered with such apparent innocence that Eleanor could not directly challenge them without appearing oversensitive or presumptuous. Catherine attempted to defend the interaction's significance, but her protests sounded desperate even to Eleanor's ears, and Sophia eventually steered the conversation toward her own recent social triumphs, recounting in detail the flowers and notes she had received from various suitors and expressing theatrical uncertainty about which gentleman she might eventually favour, and Eleanor sat quietly enduring this recital while embroidering mechanical stitches and reminding herself that this was her permanent reality, that she would spend the rest of her life watching from the margins while women like Sophia collected admiration as easily as breathing. And when Sophia finally departed an hour later, Eleanor excused herself to the garden, where Mrs. Langley found her. 20 minutes later, sitting among the spring flowers, with her embroidery abandoned, and her eyes suspiciously bright. And her aunt sat beside her without speaking for several minutes before saying gently that Eleanor must not allow Sophia's thoughtlessness or society's expectations to define what was possible, that the Duke had sought Eleanor out deliberately, and that such actions suggested intentions worthy of consideration rather than dismissal. But Eleanor shook her head and replied that hoping was more painful than accepting, that she had learned to protect herself by expecting nothing. And Mrs. Langley took her hand and said softly that sometimes the greatest courage lay not in resignation, but in allowing oneself to be surprised by joy. May 18th, 1817. 6 days had passed since Sophia's visit, and Eleanor had spent much of that time trying to follow Mrs. Langley's advice about remaining open to possibility, while simultaneously protecting herself from the dangerous temptation of hope, a balance she found nearly impossible to achieve, and so she had sought refuge in the one place that had never disappointed her, standing now in Hatchard's bookshop on Piccadilly, surrounded by the comforting smell of leather and paper and ink, running her fingers along the spines of volumes arranged on shelves that reached toward the high ceiling, losing herself in titles and authors, with the peaceful absorption that books had always provided when the world outside proved too painful to bear. The shop was quiet this afternoon, only 2 other customers visible in the dim interior, where sunlight filtered through tall windows and illuminated dancing dust motes. And Eleanor had made her way to the philosophy section at the back, where she knew she would be left undisturbed, for ladies were not expected to interest themselves in such weighty matters, and the shop clerks generally ignored her presence in this masculine domain, which suited her perfectly as she examined a volume of essays by Mary Wollstonecraft that she had been wanting to read, but which her mother would certainly consider inappropriate, and she was so absorbed in reading the opening pages that she did not hear approaching footsteps until a voice spoke almost at her elbow, asking if she found the arguments compelling. And Eleanor startled so violently that she nearly dropped the book, turning to find the Duke of Pembroke standing perhaps 2 feet away, watching her with an expression of genuine interest that made her heart perform that now familiar and entirely unwelcome acceleration. He was dressed less formally than she had seen him before, in a dark coat and simple cravat that somehow made him appear more approachable, though no less imposing, and Eleanor struggled to collect herself enough to respond, her mind racing through possible explanations for his presence here, in this specific section of this particular bookshop, at precisely the moment she happened to be visiting, and she could not decide whether to believe in coincidence or deliberate design, and if design, what that might mean about his intentions, and whether she dared allow herself to interpret his continued attention as something more than politeness extended to an object of momentary curiosity. She managed to reply that she found Wollstonecraft's ideas challenging in the best sense, that the author made arguments about women's education and capacity that Eleanor believed were fundamentally sound, though society found them threatening, and she watched the Duke's expression shift into something that looked remarkably like satisfaction as he reached past her to pull another volume from the shelf, remarking that he had read this particular work during his time at Cambridge, and had found himself in agreement with many of its conclusions, which had made him unpopular in certain circles, but which he had never seen reason to recant. And Eleanor felt something inside her chest crack open just slightly at this casual revelation that he had not only read such a work, but had formed opinions about women's intellectual equality that aligned with her own carefully hidden convictions, and before she could stop herself, she was asking what other works he had found meaningful, and he was answering with the kind of detailed thoughtfulness that made it clear these were not casual reading choices, but texts he had genuinely engaged with and considered. And somehow they had moved from philosophy to poetry to novels, their conversation flowing with an ease that Eleanor had never experienced with anyone outside her aunt. And 30 minutes passed without her awareness of time, until a shop clerk approached to inquire if they required assistance, and the interruption broke the spell enough for Eleanor to realize that she had been standing in a bookshop conversing with a duke as though they were intellectual equals, as though her opinions mattered and her thoughts deserved consideration, and the wonder of it threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure, even as she reminded herself sternly that shared literary interests did not constitute courtship, and that she must not read more into this encounter than circumstances warranted. But when he offered to purchase the Wollstonecraft volume for her, and suggested they might discuss it further at some future meeting, Eleanor found herself accepting with a gratitude that had less to do with the book itself and everything to do with the revolutionary experience of being seen. May 20th, 1817. 2 days had passed since the bookshop encounter, and Eleanor sat in Lady Westbrook's intimate dining room, surrounded by 20 guests who represented the upper echelon of London society, feeling acutely conscious of the deep blue gown she wore, the first dress she had ever chosen entirely for herself, without yielding to her mother's preference for pale, aging colours. And Mrs. Langley had accompanied her to the modiste, and had encouraged this rich shade that brought out the depth of Eleanor's eyes, and made her skin appear luminous rather than merely pale, and Eleanor had agreed partly because her aunt's enthusiasm was difficult to resist, but mostly because some small, defiant part of her wanted to look beautiful tonight, wanted to test whether Alexander's continued attention might extend to this more public setting, where the eyes of society would mark every glance and gesture and draw conclusions that could either validate or destroy the fragile hope that had taken root in her chest, despite all her efforts to prevent it. She had been shocked when the invitation arrived, for Lady Westbrook moved in circles far above the Thornhill family's modest standing, and her mother had been beside herself with speculation, until Mrs. Langley had quietly suggested that perhaps the Duke had requested Eleanor's inclusion, a possibility that Catherine found both thrilling and improbable in equal measure. And Eleanor herself had not known what to believe until she entered the drawing-room before dinner, and saw Alexander's face transform with unmistakable pleasure at her arrival, and he had crossed the room immediately to greet her with a warmth that made several other guests turn to observe this marked attention. Now she sat beside him at the long mahogany table laid with crystal and silver that caught the candlelight and threw dancing reflections across the damask tablecloth, and she was intensely aware that this seating arrangement had been deliberate, that Lady Westbrook must have received specific instructions about placement, and the implications of such planning made Eleanor's heart race even as she tried to maintain the appearance of calm dignity that had always been her shield against society's casual cruelties. Alexander directed his conversation almost exclusively to her throughout the meal, asking her opinions on topics ranging from the current political debates to questions of art and literature, and he listened to her responses with the same focused attention he had demonstrated in the bookshop, occasionally offering his own perspectives that revealed a mind both educated and genuinely curious. And Eleanor found herself relaxing into the exchange, despite the knowledge that at least a dozen people were observing their interaction with varying degrees of surprise and speculation. She could hear the whispers that the other guests did not bother to fully suppress, the shocked murmurs wondering why the Duke showed such preference for Miss Thornhill when far more beautiful and eligible ladies sat at this very table, and she caught Sophia's bewildered expression from across the room where her cousin sat beside a viscount who clearly bored her, and there was something in Sophia's face that looked almost like hurt, as though Eleanor's unexpected elevation somehow diminished Sophia's own value, and Eleanor felt an unexpected pang of sympathy for her cousin, even as she refused to apologize for finally being chosen, for finally mattering to someone whose regard she had not dared to imagine. When Alexander's hand briefly brushed hers as he reached for his wine-glass, and he let the contact linger just a moment longer than accident would explain, Eleanor felt the gesture reverberate through her entire body, and she looked up to find him watching her with an expression so tender and so certain that something inside her shifted irrevocably, and she understood with sudden clarity that this was real, that whatever was happening between them was not politeness or passing curiosity, but something far more significant, and the knowledge was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. May 25th, 1817. 5 days had passed since Lady Westbrook's dinner, and Eleanor walked beside the Duke of Pembroke along the wide path that circled the Serpentine in Hyde Park during the fashionable afternoon hour when all of London society paraded themselves beneath the full canopy of spring trees that had reached their verdant peak, and she was acutely conscious of the new walking dress she wore in a soft shade of cream with sage-green trim that Mrs. Langley had insisted upon purchasing for her at a modiste far grander than any establishment Eleanor had previously entered, and her aunt had declared that Eleanor deserved beautiful things and should stop hiding herself in the aging colours her mother favoured. And Eleanor had accepted the gift with gratitude that went deeper than the dress itself, because it represented her aunt's unwavering belief that Eleanor's life was changing in ways that merited preparation and celebration. Alexander had called at the Thornhill residence 3 times this week, each visit lasting longer than propriety strictly allowed, and each conversation ranging across topics that revealed the depths of compatibility. Eleanor had never imagined she might find with another person, and her mother had transformed from anxious skepticism to barely contained hope, to something approaching triumphant certainty. And Eleanor herself had begun the dangerous process of allowing herself to believe that his attention was genuine and lasting rather than a temporary aberration that would dissolve as inexplicably as it had appeared. They had been walking for perhaps 20 minutes, maintaining the proper distance that society demanded, while engaging in conversation that felt remarkably intimate given their public surroundings, and Alexander had been asking her opinions about improvements he was considering for the tenant cottages on his country estate, listening to her responses with the focused attention that still surprised her every time he demonstrated it. And when she suggested that better drainage and larger windows might improve both health and comfort for the families who lived there, he had stopped walking entirely and turned to look at her with an expression that made her breath catch in her throat, and he said quietly that she saw what most people in his position never bothered to notice, that she thought about the welfare of others with a care and intelligence that he found remarkable. And Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks as she tried to deflect the compliment by saying that such observations were merely common sense. But he shook his head and said no. Common sense was far less common than the phrase suggested, and what she possessed was something much rarer, which was the combination of sharp intelligence and genuine compassion. And he had been searching for exactly that combination without knowing how to name it until he had observed her these past weeks and understood that she embodied everything he valued most in human character. Eleanor felt something very like tears prick at her eyes, because no one had ever spoken to her this way, had ever suggested that the qualities she possessed, which society deemed unremarkable or even undesirable, might actually be valuable and worthy of admiration. And she managed to ask the question that had haunted her since his attention had first become apparent, asking why he had chosen to notice her when so many more beautiful and accomplished women had been readily available. And Alexander reached out to steady her elbow as they resumed walking, his hand warm through the fabric of her sleeve in the first deliberate touch he had permitted himself beyond formal courtesies. And he said softly that beauty fade and accomplishments could be learned, but character was intrinsic and rare, and he had seen in her face that first night at Lady Harrington's ball something that had stayed with him through all the subsequent introductions and conversations and dances with women who had nothing beneath their lovely surfaces. And what he had seen was dignity and intelligence and a quiet strength that came from enduring dismissal without becoming bitter. And he wanted to spend his life with someone who possessed those qualities, rather than someone who merely pleased the eye or met society's shallow expectations, and Eleanor understood in that moment that she was beginning to believe him. May 28th, 1817. 3 days had passed since the walk in Hyde Park, where Alexander had touched her arm and spoken words that had undone years of resignation. And now Eleanor stood in the entrance hall of Pembroke House, feeling as though she had stepped into a world that existed on a scale beyond anything she had previously experienced. For this ballroom was grander than Lady Harrington's had been, grander than any space she had entered in her 28 years, with ceilings that soared upward into painted heavens where classical figures danced among clouds touched with gold leaf that caught the light from 3 massive crystal chandeliers, and the walls were lined with mirrors that multiplied the candlelight and the guests until the room seemed to contain all of London society reflected into infinity. And Eleanor wore a gown of ivory silk with silver embroidery that Mrs. Langley had commissioned from the most exclusive modiste in London over Eleanor's protests about the expense. And her aunt had simply said that Eleanor would be dancing with a duke in his own home, and she would do so, dressed as befitted the occasion. And now, as Eleanor stood beside her mother and aunt, waiting to be announced, she felt her heart beating so rapidly that she feared it might be visible through the delicate fabric. She had known that attending a ball at Pembroke House would draw attention, but she had not fully anticipated the weight of hundreds of eyes turning toward her as her name was announced, had not expected to see the shock on face after face as society registered that Miss Eleanor Thornhill, the perpetual spinster whom most had ceased to notice years ago, was in attendance at the most significant social event of the season, and she saw Sophia standing near the center of the room in a confection of pink silk that must have cost a fortune, and her cousin's expression moved from surprise to something harder to define, something that looked like betrayal mixed with disbelief, as though Eleanor had violated some unspoken rule by daring to exist in this elevated space. Alexander stood at the far end of the ballroom, receiving guests with the easy grace of someone born to command such gatherings. But Eleanor saw the moment his gaze found her across the crowded room, saw his face transform with unmistakable pleasure and something deeper that made her breath catch, and he concluded his conversation with Lord and Lady Ashford with what appeared to be unseemly haste, before crossing the floor toward her with such obvious purpose that the crowd seemed to part before him, and the whispers began immediately, rippling outward from his path like water disturbed by a stone. He reached her side and bowed with perfect formality, but his eyes held warmth that made her feel as though they were alone, despite being surrounded by hundreds of observers, and he said quietly that she looked radiant, that the ivory silk made her appear like moonlight given form, and Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks as she thanked him and tried not to notice how many people were watching this exchange. And then the orchestra began the opening strains of a waltz, and Alexander extended his hand and asked if she would do him the honor of the first dance. And Eleanor understood in that moment what he was doing, understood that the host of a ball traditionally opened the dancing, and that his choice of partner was a public declaration that would be discussed and analyzed and reported throughout London before morning. And she placed her hand in his and let him lead her on to the empty floor while society watched with expressions ranging from shock to confusion to barely concealed dismay. His hand settled at her waist, and hers rested on his shoulder, and they began to move together in the intimate patterns of the waltz. And Eleanor had danced this scandalous dance only twice before in her life, and never with a partner who moved with such confidence and grace. And Alexander looked down at her with an expression so tender that she forgot to be nervous about the hundreds of eyes watching them, and he said softly that he had something important to ask her this evening, something that could not wait any longer, and Eleanor felt her heart leap, even as her mind cautioned against hope, and she managed to say that she would be honored to hear whatever he wished to say, and Alexander smiled and whispered that before this night ended, she would understand exactly how much she had come to mean to him. And as they turned across the gleaming floor beneath the glittering chandeliers, with all of London society bearing witness, Eleanor finally allowed herself to believe that this was not a dream from which she would wake to find herself once again invisible and dismissed, but rather the beginning of a life she had never dared to imagine possible. May 28th, 1817. The waltz had ended, and Alexander had led Eleanor from the crowded ballroom through a set of tall glass doors that opened onto a wide stone terrace overlooking the gardens of Pembroke House, and the cool night air touched her heated cheeks as they stepped away from the noise and light and hundreds of watching eyes into a space that felt blessedly private, despite being separated from the ballroom by only a pane of glass, and Eleanor could hear the music continuing behind them, a softer melody now that drifted into the darkness where stars had begun to appear in the late spring sky, and the scent of roses reached them from the gardens below, where Alexander had told her during their waltz that he had ordered the gardeners to cultivate Eleanor's favourite blooms, though she had not remembered mentioning her preference to him, and she stood now at the stone balustrade looking out over the shadowed landscape, trying to steady her breathing and organize her thoughts, because she understood that something significant was about to happen, and she felt as though she were standing at the edge of a precipice, waiting to discover whether she would fall or fly. Alexander moved to stand beside her close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cool air, and he said her name softly. Just Eleanor without the miss that propriety demanded, and she turned to face him and saw in his expression such tenderness that she felt her carefully constructed defenses begin to crumble like walls that had stood for years, suddenly revealed to be made of nothing more substantial than sand, and he reached for her hand and she let him take it, and his fingers were warm and steady as they closed around hers, and he said that he had brought her here because he could not wait another moment to tell her what had become undeniably clear to him over these past weeks, that from the first moment he had seen her watching the ball at Lady Harrington's with such dignity despite being overlooked by everyone, including himself, to his shame, he had been unable to forget her face. And with each subsequent meeting, his certainty had grown that she was the woman he had been searching for without knowing how to name what he sought, and Eleanor felt tears gathering in her eyes as he continued speaking, telling her that she possessed a rare combination of intelligence and compassion and strength that made every other woman he had met seem insubstantial by comparison, and he said that he knew society would wonder at his choice, and some would whisper that he might have done better, but he had never been more certain of anything in his life than he was of his desire to spend every remaining day he had been granted in her company. And then he released her hand only to lower himself to one knee on the stone terrace beneath the emerging stars, and he asked with a formality that contrasted beautifully with the emotion in his voice whether Miss Eleanor Thornhill would consent to become his wife and Duchess of Pembroke, and Eleanor discovered that she could not speak past the tears that were now flowing freely down her cheeks, and she managed only to nod and whisper, "Yes." And Alexander rose immediately and pulled her into his arms, with considerably less attention to propriety than he had previously shown, and he kissed her with a tenderness that transformed into something deeper and more urgent, and Eleanor, who had never been kissed before, understood that this was what it meant to be chosen and cherished and loved. And when they finally drew apart, he produced a ring from his pocket, a band of gold set with sapphires that matched her eyes, and he slipped it onto her finger and said that she had made him the happiest of men, and Eleanor looked at this ring that proclaimed her transformation from overlooked spinster to beloved duchess, and understood that her life had just become something she had never dared to imagine possible. May 29th, 1817. Eleanor woke in her childhood room at the Thornhill residence, with morning light streaming through curtains that had hung at these windows for as long as she could remember, and for a moment She wondered if the previous evening had been some elaborate dream conjured by a heart too long denied. But then she lifted her left hand and saw the gold band set with sapphires that caught the morning sun and threw small prisms of blue light across the familiar wallpaper. And she understood that everything had changed while she slept. That she was no longer Miss Eleanor Thornhill, the overlooked spinster, but rather the acknowledged future Duchess of Pembroke. And even as joy flooded through her, she felt a strange detachment, as though she were watching this transformation happen to someone else entirely. She rose and dressed with her mother's lady's maid helping her for the first time, rather than managing on her own, as she had always done. And when she descended to the breakfast room, she found it transformed into something resembling a florist's shop. For every available surface held vases of flowers that had been delivered since dawn, roses and lilies and exotic blooms she could not name. And her mother, Lady Catherine, sat amid this fragrant chaos with tears streaming down her face as she read what Eleanor assumed was the announcement in the morning papers. And when Catherine saw her daughter, she rose and embraced her with an intensity that was both touching and somewhat painful, saying over and over that she had never dared hope for such an outcome, that a duke had chosen Eleanor above all the younger and prettier girls, and Eleanor felt a familiar sting at this characterization, even as she understood her mother meant only to express joy at their altered circumstances. The morning callers began arriving before Eleanor had finished her tea, and the modest Thornhill drawing-room filled with ladies who had never previously found time to visit Miss Thornhill, but who now declared themselves utterly delighted by the engagement, and claimed they had always known Eleanor possessed special qualities that would attract the right gentleman. And Eleanor received these transparently false assurances with grace, while noting which women had the decency to look embarrassed by their own earlier dismissiveness. And Mrs. Langley sat in the corner watching this performance with an expression of profound satisfaction mixed with something sharper that looked like vindication. And when Sophia arrived near noon, dressed in white muslin with her blonde curls arranged in elaborate ringlets, she embraced Eleanor and said with what sounded like genuine confusion that she could not understand how this had happened, how the Duke had chosen Eleanor when he might have chosen anyone. And Eleanor saw in her cousin's pretty face not malice, but rather a complete bewilderment that suggested Sophia's understanding of the world had been fundamentally disrupted by this development, and Eleanor found she could not feel anger toward this girl who had been taught to value only youth and beauty and had built her entire sense of self on possessing both. And she took Sophia's hands and said gently that perhaps the Duke had seen something in her that others had missed, and Sophia nodded slowly, as though trying to grasp a concept that existed beyond her previous framework for understanding how the world operated. And throughout the morning Eleanor kept looking at the ring on her finger and remembering Alexander's face as he had placed it there, remembering his words about her intelligence and compassion and strength. And she understood that her transformation was not from invisible to visible, but rather from unseen to truly recognized, and that made all the difference in how she would carry this new identity forward into the life that awaited her. June 5th, 1817. Eleanor stepped through the door of Madame Devereux's exclusive establishment on Bond Street and experienced the disorienting sensation of entering a world that had previously existed only on the periphery of her awareness, for she had accompanied her mother and Sophia to this very shop on numerous occasions, but had always been relegated to a chair near the window, while fabrics and fashion plates were displayed for those whose appearance society deemed worthy of enhancement. And now Madame Devereux herself came forward with hands clasped and eyes bright with an enthusiasm that Eleanor recognized as inspired not by her person but by her newly elevated status. And the modiste said in accented English that it was an honor beyond measure to create the trousseau for the future Duchess of Pembroke. And Eleanor felt a familiar discomfort at this reverential treatment from a woman who had looked through her rather than at her, for years. Catherine had insisted on accompanying Eleanor to this appointment, and now sat examining silks and satins with an intensity that suggested she was trying to make up for all the beautiful things her daughter had been denied. But Eleanor found herself overwhelmed by the sheer volume of choices presented, the endless bolts of fabric in colors she had been discouraged from wearing because they were too vibrant or too youthful or too attention-seeking. And she was relieved when Alexander arrived precisely at the time he had promised, for he had insisted on being present for at least part of these preparations, despite Catherine's protests that such matters were not appropriate for a gentleman's involvement. And when he entered the shop, he brought with him a sense of solid reality that anchored Eleanor in this strange new experience. Alexander greeted Madame Devereux with polite formality, and then turned his full attention to Eleanor, asking whether she was finding anything that pleased her. And she confessed quietly that she was uncertain about all of it, that she had little practice in selecting things for her own adornment, and he took her hand and led her to a selection of fabrics that the modiste had arranged on a large table, and he held up a length of deep emerald silk against Eleanor's face, and said that this color made her eyes luminous. And then a sapphire blue that he declared matched the stones in her engagement ring. And Eleanor watched him engage with this process that most men would have dismissed as trivial, and she understood that his presence here was another way of demonstrating that he valued her comfort and happiness above social convention. Madame Devereux brought out fashion plates showing the latest styles from Paris, and Alexander examined them with Eleanor, asking her opinion about necklines and sleeve lengths and trim details, and when the modiste suggested that perhaps the future Duchess would prefer styles that were more modest given her age and station, Alexander said, with a coolness that made the woman blanch, that his betrothed should wear whatever styles pleased her and brought her joy, and Eleanor felt tears gather in her eyes at this casual defense of her right to beauty without apology. And later, when Catherine had stepped away to examine bonnets, and they had a moment of relative privacy among the bolts of fabric, Alexander told Eleanor that their wedding date had been firmly set for August 15th, and that he found himself impatient for the weeks to pass. And Eleanor looked at this man, who had chosen her above all others, and said that she sometimes still feared she would wake to find this had all been an elaborate dream. And Alexander lifted her hand to his lips and kissed the finger that bore his ring, and said that he would spend every day of their marriage ensuring she understood how completely real and permanent his love for her was. June 20th, 1817. The Pembroke country estate revealed itself gradually as the carriage rounded the final curve of the tree-lined approach, and Eleanor felt her breath catch as the house emerged from behind ancient oaks that must have stood for centuries, for this was not merely a grand residence, but rather something approaching a palace, with its pale stone facade stretching wider than any building she had ever inhabited, its windows reflecting the afternoon sun in countless panes of glass that suggested rooms beyond counting, and she understood with sudden clarity that her future role would be far larger than she had allowed herself to imagine during the weeks of engagement when she had focused primarily on Alexander himself, rather than the vast world that came attached to his title. Alexander sat beside her in the carriage, and she felt him watching her face as the estate came into view, and when she turned to meet his eyes, she saw a flicker of concern there, as though he worried that the grandeur might overwhelm her or make her doubt her place in his life. And she reached for his hand and squeezed it in reassurance, even as her heart raced with a nervousness she had not anticipated. For it was one thing to accept a marriage proposal from a man she had come to love, and quite another to comprehend that she would be mistress of an establishment that employed what must be hundreds of people and encompassed lands that stretched beyond the horizon. The carriage drew to a halt before the main entrance where staff had assembled in formal rows to meet their future mistress, and Alexander helped Eleanor descend with a tenderness that steadied her as she faced the housekeeper Mrs. Barrett and the butler Hendricks, and a seemingly endless line of footmen and maids and grooms, whose names she tried desperately to remember even as they blurred together in her anxious mind. But she noticed that Alexander introduced her, not with the formal distance she might have expected, but rather with a warmth that communicated clearly his regard for her, and she saw the staff respond to this signal with genuine welcoming smiles rather than merely dutiful politeness. Alexander led her through rooms that felt designed for purposes she could barely fathom. A formal dining room with a table that could seat 40. A ballroom that made the Pembroke House ballroom in London seem intimate by comparison. Drawing rooms in shades of blue and gold and green that seemed to correspond to different seasons or functions she did not yet understand, and she felt increasingly small and uncertain until they reached the library, and Alexander opened the double doors to reveal a room that took her breath away for entirely different reasons. For here were books on shelves that rose 2 stories high, with a gallery running around the upper level and tall windows that flooded the space with golden afternoon light. And Alexander said quietly that this room had been his sanctuary since childhood, and that he hoped it would become hers as well. And Eleanor walked slowly along the shelves, reading spines in Latin and Greek and French and English, finding philosophy and history and poetry and sciences all arranged with careful attention. And she turned to Alexander with tears in her eyes and said that this room alone would make the estate feel like home. He took her hand and led her to the desk that sat near the largest window, and he told her that he had asked the staff to clear this desk completely so that she might arrange it according to her own preferences and fill it with whatever books and papers she wished. And Eleanor understood that this gesture of giving her claim to his most private space was another way of demonstrating that he did not expect her to simply inhabit his world, but rather to make it truly theirs together. And later, as they walked through the gardens that surrounded the house, he asked her opinion about whether certain flower beds should be redesigned and which walking paths might be extended and where she might like a private garden area created. And Eleanor found herself offering thoughts about sightlines and seasonal color and the placement of benches with a growing confidence that came from recognizing that Alexander genuinely valued her perspective, and that her intelligence, which society had dismissed as unmarketable in a woman, was precisely what he most wanted applied to their shared future. July 10th, 1817. The intimate gathering at Pembroke House felt worlds removed from the grand social events that had dominated the season, for Alexander had insisted that this dinner include only those people who genuinely mattered to either himself or Eleanor. And so the table held merely 12 guests, including Mrs. Langley, whose eyes held quiet satisfaction as she observed her niece transformed not in essence, but in circumstance. And Lord George Ashford, who had become a true friend to Eleanor in the weeks since the engagement, and who now raised his glass in a toast that spoke of Alexander's extraordinary fortune in winning a woman of such intelligence and grace. And even Sophia, who sat beside her own recently secured fiancé, and seemed for perhaps the first time to regard Eleanor with something approaching genuine respect rather than the confused condescension that had characterized their earlier interactions. Eleanor wore a gown of deep rose silk that Alexander had commissioned specifically for this evening, and she noticed how his eyes found her repeatedly across the table during the various courses, and she felt a contentment that still carried traces of disbelief. Even after weeks of engagement, for there remained moments when she expected to wake and find herself returned to that lavender gown and that position against the ballroom wall, watching life occur at a distance from which she was perpetually excluded. Catherine sat near the head of the table, looking happier than Eleanor could remember seeing her in years, and while Eleanor understood that her mother's joy stemmed partly from social triumph, she also recognized beneath that surface pleasure a genuine relief that her daughter would not face the lonely fate of impoverished spinsterhood that had seemed so inevitable mere months ago, and Eleanor found she could forgive her mother's earlier anxieties and pressures because they had emerged from fear rather than cruelty. The dinner conversation flowed easily among topics both serious and light-hearted, and Eleanor contributed her thoughts on matters ranging from estate management to literature to the political questions that dominated the newspapers, and she noticed that no one seemed surprised or uncomfortable with her intellectual engagement and this acceptance of her full self, without requirement that she diminish or hide her capabilities, felt like a gift she was still learning to receive without suspicion. After the ladies withdrew to the drawing-room, while the gentlemen remained with port and cigars, Mrs. Langley drew Eleanor aside to a window seat overlooking the gardens that were silvered with moonlight, and her aunt took her hand and said that she had watched Eleanor endure years of dismissal with a dignity that never hardened into bitterness, and that this capacity to remain open and kind despite repeated hurt was precisely what made her worthy of the happiness she had found. And Eleanor felt tears gather as she embraced this woman who had offered support when society offered only indifference. When the gentlemen rejoined them, Alexander came directly to Eleanor's side and suggested a brief walk in the garden before the guests departed, and they stepped through the French doors onto the terrace, where the night air carried the scent of roses and honeysuckle, and Alexander told her that he counted each day until their wedding with an impatience that amazed him, for he had never imagined feeling such eagerness to bind his life permanently to another person. And Eleanor looked at this man who had seen her when she believed herself invisible and said that she would spend their marriage ensuring he never regretted his choice. And Alexander lifted her hand to his lips and said that his only regret would be the 5 weeks he had to wait until she became his wife in truth, as well as promise. August 14th, 1817. The afternoon light fell golden through the windows of Eleanor's childhood bedroom at Thornhill residence, and she stood before the wardrobe where her wedding dress hung in preparation for tomorrow's ceremony, the ivory silk catching the sun in a way that made it seem almost luminous. And she reached out to touch the fabric with fingers that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer improbability of finding herself on the eve of marriage to a man who had somehow perceived worth in her that society had entirely overlooked for 28 years. Mrs. Langley had spent the past hour with her in quiet conversation, and her aunt had spoken words that Eleanor knew she would carry forward into her marriage and beyond. For Mrs. Langley had said that the true measure of a person revealed itself not in moments of triumph, but rather in the long years of dismissal and disappointment, and that Eleanor's capacity to remain kind and open despite society's cruelty was precisely what made her worthy of the happiness she had found, and Eleanor had wept quietly against her aunt's shoulder in gratitude for this woman who had seen her clearly when others looked through her as though she were invisible. The house felt unusually quiet, despite the presence of guests who had arrived for tomorrow's wedding, for Catherine had insisted that Eleanor rest this final afternoon before her life changed irrevocably, and so Eleanor sat at her small writing desk and composed a letter to Alexander, knowing that tradition required their separation tonight, but wanting him to have words from her to carry into tomorrow. She wrote of the girl she had been at her first ball 10 years ago, full of hope and expectation that someone would see her and choose her, and how that hope had gradually dimmed through seasons of being overlooked until she had resigned herself to permanent invisibility. And she wrote of that April evening when he had danced with what seemed every woman into the ballroom except her, and how she had believed in that moment that her fate was sealed beyond question. And then she wrote of her astonishment when he began to seek her out with an attention that seemed impossible to trust. And finally, she wrote that she would spend their marriage ensuring he never regretted choosing the woman society had deemed unworthy of notice. A footman arrived with a letter bearing Alexander's seal, and Eleanor opened it with hands that shook slightly to find his bold handwriting covering the page, and he had written that tomorrow could not arrive quickly enough, for he had never imagined feeling such certainty about any decision in his life. And he wrote that the world had looked past her because the world valued only surface beauty and accomplished performance. But he had seen in her the rare combination of intelligence and kindness and dignity that made every other woman seem insubstantial by comparison, and he wrote that his only regret about their marriage was that it had not happened years earlier, so that she might have been spared the pain of society's dismissal. And he closed by saying that he would stand tomorrow at the altar, counting himself the most fortunate man in England. Eleanor folded his letter carefully and placed it in the small box where she kept her most precious possessions. And then she walked to the window and looked out over the London street where evening was beginning to fall, and she thought of how completely her life had transformed in the space of 4 months, and she wondered if she would wake tomorrow and find it all dissolved like morning mist. But then she looked at the ring on her finger and felt the weight of Alexander's love, expressed in both his daily presence and in the words he had written. And she knew with sudden clarity that this happiness was real, and that tomorrow she would become Duchess of Pembroke, and that the years of invisibility had finally ended, not because she had changed, but because someone had finally truly seen her. August 15th, 1817. Eleanor woke to sunlight streaming through the windows of her childhood bedroom, and for a moment lay perfectly still beneath the covers as she absorbed the knowledge that this was her wedding day. And the realization carried such weight of joy and disbelief that she felt tears gather even before she rose from the bed where she had slept only fitfully through the night. Catherine appeared shortly after 7 in the morning, already dressed and visibly trembling with excitement, and she embraced Eleanor with an intensity that spoke of years of worry now dissolving into relief and pride. And she said that she had never imagined seeing this day, but that she could not have dreamed of a better match for her daughter. And Eleanor forgave in that moment all her mother's earlier anxieties and pressures, because she understood they had emerged from love, however imperfectly expressed. Mrs. Langley arrived at 9 to help Eleanor dress, and together they lifted the ivory silk gown over Eleanor's head and fastened the tiny buttons that ran down the back, and her aunt arranged Eleanor's hair in a style that was elegant without being overly elaborate, and she wove small white roses through the dark strands. And when Eleanor finally looked at herself in the mirror, she saw not a different person, but rather herself as she had always been, yet somehow transformed by the knowledge that she was genuinely loved and chosen. The carriage ride to the church felt both endless and impossibly brief, and Eleanor clutched a bouquet of white roses and lavender that Alexander had sent that morning, along with a note that said simply that he would be waiting for her and that nothing had ever mattered more to him than this day. And she held those words close to her heart as the carriage wheels rolled over London streets toward the fashionable church where 200 guests had gathered. When Eleanor entered the church on her uncle's arm, she saw the pews filled with faces that had overlooked her for years, and now watched with avid attention. But she found that their regard no longer mattered, because at the end of the long aisle, Alexander stood waiting with an expression of such genuine happiness and certainty that everything else faded to insignificance. She walked toward him with steady steps, and when she reached his side, he took her hand and whispered that she looked beautiful, and the ceremony proceeded with traditional words that carried extraordinary weight. And when the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, Alexander kissed her with a tenderness that made several ladies in the congregation openly weep, and Eleanor felt in that moment that she had travelled an impossible distance from that April evening when she had stood against a ballroom wall believing herself permanently invisible, and she understood that her value had never changed, but only the eyes that perceived it, and she knew that she would spend her marriage not trying to prove her worthiness, but rather living fully into the truth that Alexander had somehow seen from the beginning. August 15th, 1817, afternoon. The wedding breakfast at Pembroke House stretched through the afternoon with courses of exquisite food that Eleanor barely tasted because she remained too aware of Alexander beside her and of the 200 guests who filled the grand dining room with conversation and laughter, and she noticed how different this attention felt from the scrutiny she had endured for years. For now people looked at her with respect and interest rather than dismissal, and she understood that nothing about her had changed except the man who sat beside her, with his hand occasionally brushing hers beneath the table in small gestures of affection that no one else could see. Lord George Ashford rose to offer a toast, and spoke of how he had known Alexander for 20 years and had never seen him as content as he had been these past months, and he said that Miss Thornhill, or rather the new Duchess of Pembroke, had accomplished what no other woman had managed, which was to make Alexander eager to abandon his bachelor freedoms in favor of married life, and the room erupted in laughter and applause, and Eleanor felt her cheeks warm even as Alexander squeezed her hand gently beneath the table. Sophia approached during the reception that followed, and embraced Eleanor with what seemed genuine warmth, and she said quietly that she had misjudged Eleanor for years, and that she hoped they might build a true friendship now, and Eleanor saw in her cousin's eyes a flicker of understanding that beauty and youth provided only temporary advantage, while character endured, and she accepted the apology with grace, though she knew that Sophia's revelation had come only after Eleanor's value had been validated by the Duke's choice. Mrs. Langley found Eleanor during a quiet moment, and held both her hands and said simply that she had always known this day would come, because true worth could not remain hidden forever. And Eleanor embraced her aunt with fierce gratitude for the years of support when no one else had believed. The afternoon lengthened toward evening, and guests began departing with effusive congratulations and knowing smiles. And finally Alexander led Eleanor to the carriage that would take them to Pembroke Estate, where they would spend their first weeks of marriage. And as the vehicle rolled through London streets, Eleanor looked back at the city where she had spent 28 years, believing herself invisible and unworthy, and she felt the weight of those years lifting like fog burned away by morning sun. Alexander pulled her close against his side and said that he had something to confess, which was that their meeting at the bookshop had not been chance, but rather deliberate planning, because he had inquired about her habits and had wanted to see her in a setting where she felt comfortable and unguarded. And Eleanor laughed and said she had suspected as much, but had been afraid to trust her instincts. And he kissed her temple and said that he would spend their marriage teaching her to trust both her instincts and his constant scent. The countryside rolled past the carriage windows as evening fell, and Eleanor rested her head against Alexander's shoulder and thought of how completely her life had transformed since that April night when she had watched him dance with every woman except her, and she understood now that his failure to ask her that night had not been dismissal, but rather the last moment before her true life began, and she felt profound gratitude not only for Alexander, but for the years of invisibility that had taught her the difference between surface regard and genuine love. September 1818, 1 year after the wedding. Eleanor stood in the morning room at Pembroke Estate, with autumn sunlight streaming through tall windows, and her hand resting unconsciously on the gentle swell of her abdomen where their first child grew. And she watched Alexander through the glass as he walked the grounds with the estate manager discussing preparations for winter, and she felt a contentment so profound that it still surprised her even after 12 months of marriage, for she had learned that happiness could be steady rather than fleeting, and that love deepened rather than diminished with daily intimacy. The past year had transformed not just her circumstances, but her understanding of her own worth, for Alexander's consistent devotion had slowly erased the years of internalized dismissal, until she could look in the mirror and see what he had apparently seen from the beginning, which was a woman of intelligence and grace and quiet strength, whose value had never depended on society's recognition. They had settled into rhythms of married life that felt both extraordinary and comfortingly ordinary, with mornings spent in companionable silence over breakfast, and afternoons when Eleanor managed household affairs with the same thoughtfulness she had once applied only to books, and evenings when they sat together in the library, discussing everything from estate matters to philosophy, while the fire crackled and the outside world faded to insignificance. Catherine had visited twice from London and had wept both times at seeing Eleanor so obviously happy and secure, and she had apologized more than once for the years of pressure and anxiety, though Eleanor had assured her that all was forgiven because those difficult years had taught her to value genuine love over superficial approval. Sophia had married Lord Ashford in June and had written to Eleanor with surprising honesty that she finally understood what true partnership meant and that she was grateful for Eleanor's example. And Eleanor had responded with warmth because she bore no grudge against those who had dismissed her when she herself had half believed their assessment. Mrs. Langley visited monthly and always remarked that Eleanor seemed to grow more beautiful with each passing season, and Eleanor understood that her aunt was observing not physical change, but rather the visible manifestation of being deeply known and cherished. Alexander entered the morning room as Eleanor stood lost in reflection, and he crossed to her immediately and placed his hand over hers where it rested on her abdomen. And he said quietly that he had been thinking about that April evening when he had danced with every eligible woman except her, and had realized only later that he had been searching the entire night for something he could not name until he saw her watching from the shadows with an expression of dignified resignation that had haunted him for weeks. Eleanor leaned against him and said that she was grateful he had not asked her to dance that night, because she would have been too guarded and frightened to reveal her true self, and she needed the subsequent weeks of gradual courtship to learn to trust his sincerity. And he kissed the top of her head and said that he would spend their lifetime proving that his love was not aberration, but rather recognition of what had always been true. She turned in his arms and looked up at his face and said that she wanted their children to grow up knowing that their worth was inherent rather than granted by others' opinions, and he promised that they would raise sons and daughters who valued character over appearance and substance over status. And Eleanor felt in that moment the completion of a journey that had begun in pain, but had led to joy beyond anything she had imagined possible during those years of invisibility.